Everybody, I think we're going to get going here so that I don't have to keep you too late tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dave Nichols. I'm the Executive Director here. If you're a member with us, thank you very much. If you're not a member with us, I encourage you to consider becoming one. Your membership helps us be able to do great programs like this and all the other fun things we get to do throughout the year. If you are a member with us, you're going to hear this a lot this year. But this is our centennial year. Our CHS is turning 100 as of the first year, so we're going to be doing a lot of different additional programs for our centennials, so keep an eye out for all of those fun things coming up. Gabe has done a couple of different talks with us. He's, I can't remember where you went to school, I'm so sorry.
University of North Dakota.
So, UND, and I think you're pursuing a history degree still, right? Yeah? Okay. So he's going to be doing a talk for us today on Minnesota's 1st Regiment, which we're going to be learning all about. So please join me in welcoming Gabe.
Hey, my name is Gabe Blumer. I'm studying history and secondary education at the University of North Dakota. I came here last year and I gave a talk about Oliver Lonke, who is a Civil War veteran who helped track down John Wilkes Booth following Lincoln's assassination. The Civil War is my big passion in U.S. history. I love studying it, I love reading about it. It's just something that just means a lot to me. And I've spent the last semester at UND. I've been studying its history, I've been studying the 1st Minnesota Regiment in particular, and I've visited the archives at the Minnesota History Center in St. Paul. So in the process of building this project, I've gone through numerous resources. The biggest help for me was Richard Moe's last full measure, a full history on the 1st Minnesota. That was a fantastic read, and it helped greatly with building this presentation. And I'm excited to share all of my information and my project with you today. Special thank you to Rice County for allowing me to come here and present, and also a thank you to my grandfather, Vern Meyer, for giving me this passion for history I present today. So, this is the 20th Virginia Infantry Battle Flag. This flag was captured on July 3rd, 1863 at the Battle of Gettysburg. This flag kind of represents the legacy of the 1st Minnesota today. It was captured by Marshal Sherman, and it is currently stored at the Minnesota Historical Society in St. Paul. Virginia frequently wants this flag back. They have a problem with Minnesota storing it. They want it back. But to quote Predator star Jesse Ventura, why? I mean, we won the war. So this flag kind of represents, again, the legacy of the 1st Minnesota and is the centerpiece of our story. But before we get to why it's so important, we have to go through how the 1st Minnesota got to capturing this battle flag. So this is, So just personally, my introduction to the 1st Minnesota really came from my visit to Gettysburg in 2023. I went out east with my grandparents and visited Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, and it was really eye-opening. I had a vague idea of what the 1st Minnesota was. I knew they had acted at Gettysburg. I didn't know the detail about it, but I had a general idea that they were important. I really had no idea the depth of it. And that's kind of because with the Civil War, there's almost a lack of discussion of the 1st Minnesota. If you ever seen the movie Gettysburg, they cover the 20th Maine and their charge at Little Round Top. 1st Minnesota is not mentioned at all in the 4-hour runtime. And even reading books, like I just recently got this giant Civil War atlas that was published by National Geographic. On day 2 of Gettysburg, the 1st Minnesota's high point, there's no mention of the 1st Minnesota in there. So it's really unfortunate that the 1st Minnesota is kind of relegated to a state history, as they are true heroes of the Union. So this is a battle flag of the 1st Minnesota. This battle flag, it's a picture of a original one, and it's not well kept, as you can see. The 1st Minnesota was the first unit established in the Civil War for the Union, and there were about 1,000 soldiers in it. There were a little bit more than 1,000, but soldiers came and went because of injuries, casualties, death. And the average age of a Civil War soldier was 25. But for the 1st Minnesota, it was about 23. So these guys are not old. These are young guys going into battle in the Civil War, and going in, they have really no expectations. Why would they? So these are two prominent figures in the 1st Minnesota's history. This is Alexander Ramsey. He is the 2nd governor of Minnesota. He was the 1st territorial governor of Minnesota, so he has a lot of history with the state. He's governor from 1860 to 1863. And he just happens to be in D.C. when Fort Sumter is fired upon. So he goes straight to Edwin Stanton's desk, who was Lincoln's Secretary of War, and he offers 1,000 troops for the Union cause. So he becomes the first Minnesota becomes the 1st regiment enlisted in the Union. And during the war, he really has to shift his focus kind of away from the Civil War toward the U.S.-Dakota conflict that was happening right in Minnesota at the time. And he kept in politics even after his run as Minnesota governor. He spends time in the Senate and even actually serves as Secretary of War for future President Rutherford B. Hayes. So he has a storied career. This guy on the right is Josias Ridgegate King, and he is claimed to be the first soldier ever to join the Civil War. He lived in Minnesota at the time, but actually had spent most of his career as a 49er. So he went out to California panning for gold, and he didn't fail, but he didn't succeed either. He found moderate success, but nothing huge. And he is at the St. Paul Armory meeting when he signs up for the Civil War. He becomes the first guy to go down and write his name for the Civil War. It's disputed whether he was actually the first person to sign up. There's a man in Texas who has a claim to be the first soldier to sign up for the Civil War, but more evidence points towards Josias Ridgegate King being the first soldier to sign up for the Civil War. And he will die in 1916 after returning to panning for gold after the Civil War. This is what I would consider the main character of our story here. This is William Colville. He was born in 1830 in New York, and he started studying law under future President Millard Fillmore. Colville then comes to Minnesota, and he becomes the editor of Red Wing's Daily Republican. And when the Civil War breaks out, he is chosen as the captain of Company F. So he is brought into Minnesota, and he will slowly throughout the war climb through the ranks. But he is a very prominent figure in history, and you'll see why. This is the M1861 Springfield 58 rifle musket, and the 1st Minnesota is going to be carrying these throughout the war. This was by far the most common weapon for the Union in the Civil War, and it was very reliable and very accurate. It's accurate, extremely accurate within 200 to 400 yards. That's when it's going to hit best, but it can go 800 to 1,000 yards. So it has some distance on it. And the officers are going to carry these, but they're also going to carry sidearms. But for the average soldier, they're just going to be carrying this. So this is a photo of the 1st Minnesota training at Fort Snelling. They came to Fort Snelling, and really none of these men had too much. They came from the south and southeast portion of the state. And these men all kind of had to bond together. Remember, Minnesota becomes a state in 1858. And all these people are really not from Minnesota. They're from Pennsylvania, they're from New York, they're from the Northeast. These guys all came to Minnesota looking for work, looking for opportunities. A lot of these guys are in the logging business, because that is a huge thing around this time, especially in the areas like Stillwater down in St. Croix. And these men spend a good amount of time just forming bonds with each other at Fort Snelling. And there are a lot of varied soldiers who sign up for this 1st Minnesota. The youngest soldier in the 1st Minnesota is actually 15. He fakes his age, and we have a 15-year-old sign up for the Civil War. He was supposed to be 18, but he did not get the message. We have 2 brothers who fight together through the entire Civil War, and we get a ton of good writing, good letters, and just fascinating details from them. Their names are Isaac and Patrick Taylor. Their story continues through the entire war and will have its conclusion at Gettysburg. And a young man with poor eyesight named James Hill tried to sign up for the 1st Minnesota, but he was shot down due to not being able to pass a physical. So that's unfortunate for him, and unfortunately James J. Hill was not part of the 1st Minnesota. He went on to do something else.
Train.
So the 1st Minnesota spends a good amount of time at Fort Snelling. They're preparing, they're getting excited. They really have no idea what this war is going to be like. The previous war for the U.S. was the Mexican-American War, and none of these guys are old enough to have served in it. These guys all think this is going to be a big battle and we're all going to go home. They really had no idea what the horrors of war are going to look like for them. So the first battle the 1st Minnesota will fight in is the First Battle of Bull Run. It was on July 1st, 1861, and it really defined what the Civil War would look like. People came out to this battle and picnicked. They genuinely thought that this battle was going to be a one and done. The Union was going to destroy the South. They're going to say, all right, we give up, and the Union is going to win. South is going to go back. That is not what happened. 1st Minnesota actually ends up being one of the first their first regiments to arrive. They're right here. They're positioned right here on Henry Hill on the southern part. And there's a big problem that arises with the Union at the Bull Run. It's not what you'd expect. Problem is, nobody is wearing anything similar. They're all wearing different things. And this is a problem because the South is also wearing different things. Nobody can tell who anyone is. And this becomes a problem because the 1st Minnesota arrives early in the day and they're positioned on their hill. And they're wearing gray. They're one of 5 units wearing gray. You want to know who else is wearing gray? The Confederates. So, the Confederates show up under command of Joseph E. Johnston, who was a very competent Southern commander. The Union is commanded by General Irwin Dowell, who's solid, but he's not as good as Johnston. And the 1st Minnesota is positioned right on this high ground here. And they spot another regiment wearing gray, the 33rd Virginia. And their goal here is to defend an artillery battery. So they see this unit, and they're also wearing gray. So they're not really sure, are these friends or are these the Confederates? And they have the jump on this unit, but the hesitation leads to them being fired on by the 33rd Virginia, who will become part of one of the most infamous brigades in the entire Union, the Stonewall Brigade. So Stonewall Jackson and his Stonewall Brigade will start laying into the 1st Minnesota, and the 1st Minnesota fires back, but by the end of Bull Run will suffer the highest casualties on the Union on either side during the battle. They'll suffer 190 casualties total out of 1,000, with 49 killed, 107 wounded, and 34 missing. This fighting is super close quarters. These men are firing and they're not missing. These units are very close together. So it's brutal for the Union fighting. And these men are realizing that this war is not going to be easy. It's going to be difficult and it's going to be brutal. And the people spectating on the hill are realizing this as well. The Battle of Bull Run really set the tone for what the Civil War would become. 1st Minnesota is one of the last Unions to leave, and they are praised for their performance. Despite suffering such high casualties, they stood firm, and they are credited for that. So, following the Battle of Bull Run, General George B. McClellan, everyone's favorite Civil War general, is put in charge. And he decides that he's going to lead an invasion into Virginia after months of fighting with Lincoln to actually invade the South. And he chooses to, instead of just moving directly south, he's going to attack from the peninsula. So he's going to come in from the Atlantic and hit Virginia on the side. So he lands on March 17th at Fort Monroe and begins what starts being known as the Peninsula Campaign. And he's making good success. He's moving up through the Union. And he reaches Yorktown and meets General John Magruder, who was commanding the Confederates. And John Magruder actually had a background in theater. So John Magruder has about 11,000 men here. For context, George McClellan has 121,000. But given Magruder is a top-tier director, he positions his army so that they're hard to see. They're behind woods, they're in marshes. And he actually paints artillery pieces out of rocks and trees and maneuvers his 11,000 men. So McClellan believes he's outnumbered. Keep in mind, McClellan has 121,000. And McClellan, instead of just going and fighting Magruder, ends up settling in for a month-long siege at Yorktown, in which time the Confederates can resupply and get better prepared. Eventually, the Union breaks the Yorktown siege and continues to move forward. And eventually, Joseph E. Johnston is injured. And he's replaced by a little-known general, you may have heard of him, named Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee will beat McClellan repeatedly at the 7 Days battles, which start at Seven Pines. And they're close combat, they're very tough battles, and the Union is repeatedly defeated again and again. They were able to see Richmond at a certain point, but Lee absolutely destroys McClellan and forces them back to Malvern Hill. And Malvern Hill is a little bit different than the rest of these. The Union is positioned on this high ground, and they get time to build up fortifications. So the Union is positioned well, and Lee starts sending waves at the Union and is unsuccessful. The Confederates suffer pretty bad casualties, and the Union is successful, but they're so debilitated from fighting Lee and losing that they end up having to pull out of the Peninsula Campaign after the Battle of Malvern Hill. But Lee sends waves and waves of troops at fortified Union lines. Surely that won't come back again, will it? So, following the Peninsula Campaign, the Second Battle of Bull Run is fought, which the 1st Minnesota did not fight at, and McClellan is taken out of command, and then after John Pope performs terribly, is put back in command for the Battle of Antietam. Lee decides he's going to invade the North. He's going to invade Maryland. And what makes Maryland interesting is that Maryland is one of the few Union states that practices slavery. It's very prominent in one half of the state. The other half is very pro-Union. And D.C. is positioned right between Virginia and Maryland. So D.C. is right in the middle. If Maryland decides to switch to the Confederacy, that's a big problem. So Lee invading invading Maryland was a really big deal. And Lee invades the wrong part of Maryland. Lee invades the part of Maryland that's very pro-Union, so that doesn't help the sentiments of the people that the Confederates are invading a very pro-Union section of the state. And this invasion does not go too well for him. Lee actually loses some battle plans, and they get found by the Union wrapped around cigars in a field. So McClellan has Lee's battle plans. He has more troops than Lee. And he wins the Battle of South Mountain and corners Lee in between the Potomac River and basically a bunch of mountains on the side. Lee is pinned. McClellan has so many more troops than he does. And yet, the Battle of Antietam results in a draw. The 1st Minnesota is positioned right around here. They're assaulting the east and west woods. It really does not go well for them. It's a draw, and many men's lives are just basically fed into this grinder that goes nowhere. The 1st Minnesota arrived with 435 men following Bull Run, following the Peninsula Campaign, and they suffer 125 casualty toll for a 28% casualty rate, which was very high at the time. But later, that 28% number is going to seem like nothing. And the 1st Minnesota, again, are praised for their work at Antietam. They're not retreating. They're holding firm. They're performing well. And despite their efforts, McClellan's incompetence leads to Lee escaping across the Potomac River in the night. So as much as Antietam should be a Union absolute win and should end the war, Lee escapes, and it's a draw. But strategically, Antietam is a very large win for the Union. Following Antietam, the Emancipation Proclamation is released by Abraham Lincoln. And this frees all the slaves in the South, but also keeps Europe out of the war. Europe is very anti-slavery at this point for the most part, especially the UK. The UK doesn't have slaves, and there is a problem where Confederates are found on UK ships, and UK might decide, hey, we want our cotton back, we're going to trade with the Confederacy. So the Emancipation Proclamation, making the war about slavery, keeps Europe out of the war, which really helps the U.S. and really makes it so that the Confederacy will essentially have to defeat the Union on the military ground rather than the diplomacy ground. But for the 1st Minnesota, this does not set in, and this is a very demoralizing period for the 1st Minnesota. It seems like Lee is unstoppable. It's loss after loss. Following McClellan's, he will be taken out of command following Antietam, and will be replaced by General Ambrose Burnside, who will fight the Battle of Fredericksburg, which is a disaster for the Union. The 1st Minnesota did not fight on the front of Marye's Heights, which saw Union troops being sent into a wall and just massacred repeatedly. They fought on the left side of the battle, where the Union actually broke through. But again, it's demoralizing for the Union. 1st Minnesota is going to be defeated. The Union is going to be defeated again and again, and it's going to get in their heads. again at the Battle of Chancellorsville, Lee is going to pull off one of the most impressive military victories of all time and defeat a Union force that had over double of men he did under General Joe Hooker. And Lee is going to seem like a god to these men. He's going to see, can anyone defeat this man? And to Lee, this gets in his head. Lee starts thinking, I'm unstoppable, no one can defeat me, and that's going to be a problem. And these Union defeats are very tiring and frustrating for the 1st Minnesota. And that is going to lead to the Battle of Gettysburg. And that's the kind of mental state the 1st Minnesota is coming into this battle with. Between December 11th through 15th, 1862, and April and May, they are positioned in camp in Maryland. They are recuperating. There was not much fighting in the winter of that year, and at least on the Eastern Front. And that is why there's big gaps between here. In between these battles, they're positioned at Edwards Ferry, at other spots, and they're recuperating, they're gathering for their next campaign. But the Battle of Gettysburg is important. Lee, once again, is invading the North. He invades Pennsylvania, and the Union is in complete disarray. This guy is George Gordon Meade. He's an American. He is from the Northeast. He's actually born in Cadiz, Spain. His parents were over there for work, and he is an American, but he's born in Spain. And he's gradually promoted throughout the war. He fought at Fredericksburg and was very successful there, and Lincoln recognized that. And on June 28th, with Robert E. Lee in Pennsylvania, George Gordon Meade is promoted to commander of the Army of the Potomac, which is a crazy situation. The undefeated enemy is in your territory, and you are in command of the entire Union Army. What are you going to do? He's nicknamed Snapping Turtle Meade because of his temper, and he has a few disagreements with another general named Dan Sickles, who we will get to. So, the Confederates are invading Pennsylvania, and Gettysburg is almost really an accidental battle. The Confederates move up into Pennsylvania, and they are short on supplies. Obviously, they're in enemy territory. You're going to have a lot more problems with supplies. So, Lee sends A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell, his troops, and he sends them to go look for supplies, particularly shoes, in the nearby town of Gettysburg. So, in particular, General Henry Heth moves into Gettysburg looking for shoes. And John Buford, who's captaining a Union cavalry regiment, just happens to run into him in Gettysburg. And both sides start fighting and mobilizing. So on day one, what starts as the Great Confederate Shoe Hunt is now a huge battle with both sides rapidly increasing numbers, and now has 160,000 men involved, which is one of the highest amounts in the entire war. The first day of battle, the Confederates push the Union all the way back through the town, and by the evening they are positioned at high ground on Cemetery Hill. The 1st Minnesota doesn't really arrive until the evening. They don't fight on day one, and most troops do not, but they are all positioned on this high ground. And the 1st Minnesota has a new commander now. William Colville is now colonel of the 1st Minnesota, and he's now in charge of this battle-tested regiment. So, before we get into day two, there's an important figure I should talk about. This is Dan Sickles. He is a war Democrat, which means that he is a member of the Democrat Party who was in support of the Union, which was not that common in the 1860s. Most of the Democrats prior to the Civil War went and joined the South. Dan Sickles decided to stay in the Union and serve in the Army. And because of that, he got a little bit of special treatment with his military rank. He gets promoted to a Major General before Gettysburg, but really is not deserving of it. He is not at the same level of commander as Meade or anyone else. And he gets treatment from his connections in New York and the fact that he's a war Democrat. He comes into the war with some baggage, though. He has a scandal he's coming out of. His wife was having an affair prior to the war. And his wife was actually having an affair with a man named Philip Barton Key. If that name sounds familiar, he's the son of Francis Scott Key, who authored the Star-Spangled Banner. And Sickles finds out about this affair, and given that he's a very logical and educated man, he decides the first thing he's going to do is execute Key in the middle of town in front of everybody. So, Dan Sickles goes out and shoots the sitting DC District Attorney, Philip Barton Key, in front of a bunch of people, and he gets quoted as saying, "You scoundrel, you have dishonored my house, you must die." So he shoots the sitting DC's District Attorney, and he has connections in Washington, and he has important connections. One of his lawyers is actually future Lincoln's Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and another one of his people aiding him in his trial is William Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State. They were not in those roles yet, this is 1859, but they become very prominent members in politics. And in his trial, where he's claiming temporary insanity, he, among other things, shakes hands with the President of the United States, James Buchanan. So, and he gets off on killing the DC District Attorney with temporary insanity. First person in U.S. history ever to get off with murder with temporary insanity. But I don't see any corruption here. This seems very legitimate to me. And just to make sure that his reputation maintains as a very good, honorable man, newspapers around Washington are writing that Dan Sickles saved the ladies of Washington from Key. So there's some 1860s newspapers for you. And he's promoted to Major General right before the Battle of Gettysburg. So day 2 of Gettysburg starts, and the Union is on what is generally called a fishhook formation. There's high ground all around this period, and their position, it looks like a fishhook. Because and Dan Sickles might have a little bit of an ego problem, just based off what I know. And Dan Sickles sees some ground that's a little bit higher in front of him here. And Dan Sickles decides, screw me, I know better. I'm going to move all my troops up to this front line in front of the Peach Orchard and the Devil's Den. And this creates a huge gap in the Union line. Can you see why this might be a problem? So, Lee is surrounding the Union, and Sickles moves all of his troops, and Meade finds out about this. And Snapping Turtle Meade, famous for his temper, rides over to Dan Sickles and starts shouting at him, but it's ultimately useless because right as he does this, Longstreet launches his assault on the south. And the Union is in chaos. This is all disorganized. General Winfield Scott Hancock is trying to organize all the troops, trying to plug this gap. And the 1st Minnesota, who's positioned right in here, can see all of this. They see all this disorganization. And they're about to do what makes them famous. So, 1st Minnesota is positioned right here. Sickles is down here. He's opened up a huge gap, and the Union is in disarray. 1st Minnesota sees 5 regiments of Alabama troops under General Cadmus Wilcox heading right towards them. And if Cadmus Wilcox breaks through right here, that's going to be a big problem. There's about 1,200 Alabama troops right here. If you squeeze 1,200 troops right in the middle of the Union line, that's going to be a problem. And the Confederates can back that up. They can send more troops through there. It is very important the Union plug this hole. And the 1st Minnesota is the only unit within reach to actually stop this. And Winfield Scott Hancock, the Major General of the Union, sees this. He rides up to Colonel William Colville, leading the 1st Minnesota, and he asks, Commander, what regiment is this? And he says, this is the 1st Minnesota. And Hancock says some lines that will go down in history. Do you see those colors, Colonel Colville? Colville says yes, and then Hancock says, then take those colors. And the 1st Minnesota launches the charge that will make them go down in history. So, this is a good way of framing what the 1st Minnesota was looking at. This is from Game of Thrones. And this is Jon Snow facing down Ramsay Bolton's army. And Jon Snow has no hope of coming out of this battle alive, but he's fighting for his cause and hopes that he can do enough to get the other army to fill this and win the battle for him. This is what the 1st Minnesota men were feeling. None of these men had an inclination. They never thought they were going to come out of this alive. The bravery of these men is ridiculous. They're charging at these troops with no thought of coming out of this alive, but doing it because they cared about their country that much. So, 1st Minnesota has 262 men. They're charging 1,200. And they enter basically 15 minutes of hell. They're fighting the Confederates for 15 minutes, and they are trying to stop this charge. And they are successful. They hold off the Confederates enough for the Union to fill that line and hold the line at Gettysburg for day 2. They saved the Union line at Gettysburg on day 2. Without the 1st Minnesota, that line is shattered. But there's a cost to this. They enter with 262 men. Only 47 out of the 262 walk out without being either severely injured or dead. 82% casualty rate. That is the highest in the entire war. Remember the 28% casualty rate, which was the highest at Antietam? This is the highest in the entire war. And you have people like Charlie Goddard, remember, who was 15 entering the war. He's 17 at the Battle of Gettysburg. He will sustain injuries that will affect him for the rest of his life, and he will eventually die of injuries sustained in this battle at the age of 23. So these are brutal fighting. These men are getting absolutely killed, and it's horrific. There's people with bones sticking out of their legs. They're screaming. There's pleading for help, and this is horrific for the 1st Minnesota, but they do what needs to be done. And Cadmus Wilcox, the Confederate general, will later be quoted as saying to Longstreet, "The problem is not getting there, the problem is staying there," and he's referring to the 1st Minnesota plugging the line. Isaac and Patrick Taylor had fought through the entire war together, and they had written some of the most well-written letters home about the war and about what was going on. And unfortunately, Isaac Taylor was killed at the Battle of Gettysburg on this day, and his brother Patrick had to go after the battle, bury his brother on the battlefield, and then write home to his sister and mother what happened to his brother. So as much as this is something that's heroic and amazing, it's also something that's incredibly tragic for the men involved. This is Winfield Scott Hancock. He was the Major General in charge of the 1st Minnesota at this battle. He's also got an interesting career, though not as chaotic as Dan Sickles. He served in the Mexican-American War like most Civil War generals. Most of them served in the Mexican-American War either as soldiers or brigadier generals, and then got promoted for the U.S. Civil War. And he becomes a Major General before Gettysburg. He's positioned right at the center, and he goes down as a war hero. And after Gettysburg, he's going to help Grant in his overland campaign. So he's going to stay in the war, and in 1880, he's actually going to run for president against James Garfield as a Democrat on this basis of I'm a war hero. And he eventually, in 1885, will organize Ulysses S. Grant's funeral. So this guy had a very storied career. And he is quoted after Gettysburg Day 2 as saying, "I had no alternative but to order the regiment in. We had no force on hand to meet the sudden emergency. Troops had been ordered up and were coming on the run, but I saw that in some way 5 minutes must be gained or we were lost. It was fortunate that I found there such a grand body of men as the 1st Minnesota. I knew they must lose heavily, and it caused me pain to give the order for them to advance. But I would have done it, even if I had known every man would be killed. It was a sacrifice that must be made. The superb gallantry of those men saved our line from being broken." And again, like many, he will be crediting the 1st Minnesota as saviors of the Union. If you are wondering what happened to Dan Sickles after this battle, Dan Sickles will be hit by artillery and lose his leg. And Dan Sickles will have his leg donated to the National Museum of Medicine. You can actually still see it today. And he will go to every Gettysburg reunion, and he will continually proclaim for the rest of his career that he actually was the hero of Gettysburg. He knew what was going on, and he made the right decision. And he will also, when he goes to these reunions, every year visit his leg. So he got his head handed. So Gettysburg Day 3 is probably the most famous. If you ask an average person, what do you know about Gettysburg? They're going to be able to probably tell you about Day 3. And at this point, it's really questionable why Lee didn't just pull out. The Union was injured. They were battered. Lee is right between the Union and D.C. There's nothing stopping Robert E. Lee from going straight to D.C. and trying to take the capital. And Longstreet thought as much. He said, "It is, in my opinion, that no 15,000 men ever arranged can take that position." But Lee really got in his own head. He viewed himself as essentially a god at this point, and thought, the enemy is here, I'm going to take him here. And the previous day, Lee had attacked both flanks. He had attacked Culp's Hill and he had attacked Little Round Top. The Union had held off both. And in classic Napoleonic strategy, you attack the flanks, and then you attack the center, because the enemy had to weaken their center to defend the flanks. And Lee launches his assault at the Union line. And just to get an idea of why this might be a bad idea to attack here, here's two images I have just displaying it. So, the Union are positioned essentially right behind this wall right here of the rocks. They're all sitting here, and Lee is right down here at this statue. So this is what the Union is looking at. They're on the top of a hill, and they see the Confederates down there. They are well fortified. This is what the Confederates are looking at. This random guy here, me, is walking up. These are what the Confederates are looking at. The Union is right here on this arrow. This is where the Union is positioned. That's what the arrow is marking. That's where the Union line is. And they are walking straight up a hill. Keep in mind the Union has artillery here as well. So the Confederates are walking straight up into Union fire and artillery. Can you see why Longstreet thought this might be a bad idea to attack? So the Confederates start marching in what will go down as Pickett's charge. And a battered 1st Minnesota is actually placed right at the center of Pickett's charge. The 47 men that walked out unarmed, they're going right back into battle. They are right in the center. And they only have 2 companies fight. They have Company C and Company F, because that's how many men they have to form. They initially had Companies A through F. They can only form 2 companies because of how many men are currently either getting limbs amputated or are dead. And the Confederates are marching right towards the Union center. So the 1st Minnesota is holding off the line, and they will suffer a 15% casualty rate, which is not nearly as bad as the previous days, but still not good. And the Confederates will be destroyed in this attack. The Confederates are absolutely hit by the Union lines. The artillery is brutal, and the Confederates have to flee. Lee is shouting to these guys, "This is all my fault," and this is the really considered the high water mark of the Confederates. It will only be downhill from here. In the fighting, the 1st Minnesota is able to capture the 20th Virginia Infantry flag. It's captured by Marshal Sherman, who will win the Medal of Honor for this, and there'll be one other Medal of Honor awarded to the 1st Minnesota. I'll explain why. But all of the current commanders of the 1st Minnesota, aside from Colville, who's injured, will be killed on day 3, including one from Fort Faribault and one from Stillwater. And Sherman, who captures this flag, will actually lose his leg in the process. And this is the flag that is currently held by the Minnesota to this day. So these are the 2 Medals of Honor issued. They're both issued for day 3 for the 1st Minnesota. This is Marshal Sherman and his battle flag that he captured. And Henry O'Brien has a crazy story. So on day 3, he noticed a fallen soldier ahead of him that was injured but not dead. And after being shot twice in the hand and once in the head, Henry O'Brien went out, saved that soldier, and brought him back, while also retrieving another flag. And he did this all after being shot 3 times. So he was something else. And these are two monuments that exist at Gettysburg today, the 1st Minnesota. They are the only monuments in the park to the 1st Minnesota. If you're curious, that's the Pennsylvania monument. And Gettysburg's in Pennsylvania, so they felt they wanted the biggest monument in the park. And if you're curious, I can read to you what is written on this monument. On the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, Sickles' 3rd Corps, having advanced from this line to the Emmitsburg Road, 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota Regiment, numbering 262 men, were sent to this place to support a battery. Upon Sickles' repulse as his men were passing here in confused retreat, 2 Confederate brigades in pursuit were crossing the swale. To gain time to bring up the reserves and save this position, General Hancock in person ordered the 8 companies to charge the rapidly advancing enemy. The order was instantly repeated by Colonel William Colville, and the charge instantly made down the slope at full speed through the concentrated fire of the 2 brigades, breaking with the enemy with the bayonet the enemy's front line as it was crossing the small brook in the low ground. There, the remnants of the 8 companies, nearly surrounded by the enemy, held its entire force at bay for a considerable time, till it retired on the approach of the reserve. The charge successfully accomplished its object. It saved the position and probably the battlefield. The loss of the 8 companies in the charge was 215 killed and wounded, more than 82%. 47 men were still in line and no missing. In self-sacrificing, desperate valor, this charge has no parallel in any war. The next day, the regiment participated in the repelling Pickett's charge, losing 17 more men killed and wounded. And keep in mind what was mentioned here, they had no men missing. All of their casualties were either severe injuries or dead, just because of the nature of them being surrounded by the enemy. And remember, someone being wounded in war does not necessarily mean a casualty of wounding does not mean they will survive. A lot of these men were wounded and then later died of their injuries, and that's only counted as wounded for. So, oh shoot. So, the 1st Minnesota Regiment was basically destroyed after this. The 1st Minnesota Infantry Battalion is formed about a year later. And in between this year of the 1st Minnesota Regiment not really serving in battle and this battalion being formed, they actually served up in New York. There was some severe draft riots because the Union instituted a policy where rich, older people could actually pay young, not rich people to serve in the Union Army for them. You can understand why people might be upset about that. So they spend a good amount of time up in New York trying to quell that. And then they go back to Fort Snelling for a little while. And then the men who are able to fight actually form this infantry battalion and go and serve in Ulysses S. Grant's Appomattox campaign. So these men who had been through so much, seen so much hardship and defeat, go back into the war. That is crazy to me. These men could leave and go back home and work. These men chose, despite all of the hardship that had been so far, to go back into the war. And the 1st Minnesota Infantry Battalion is disbanded from service in 1865. All the men are honorably discharged. And for these soldiers, it was definitely an emotional moment saying goodbye. You had formed bonds with these men that you had fought in the war for several years with. It had to mean something, saying goodbye and going your separate ways with these men. The 1st Minnesota's total casualties throughout the war were 609 wounded and 286 fatalities out of 1,000 to begin with. After the war, the men were they made it a priority to go to reunions and to share the story of the 1st Minnesota. This is William Colville in 1897 at the dedication to the monument we talked about earlier at Gettysburg. He would die in 1905, but he, for the rest of his life, would walk with a cane following Gettysburg. He was shot in the leg. He had the option to have it removed, but decided no, and he decided he's going to walk with a cane. He was actually 6'5" in 1863, which was very rare. And that's why he's super tall compared to the monument. This is a reunion of Minnesota veterans in 1909. This is not at Gettysburg, but it is in Minnesota. A lot of these reunions, if they couldn't make it out to Gettysburg, were held in Minnesota, and these veterans definitely cared about each other and wanted to practice these reunions. The 1st Minnesota has a lot of praise from people, most notably Calvin Coolidge. In 1928, he actually came up to Cannon Falls, Minnesota to dedicate the Colville statue that is present there today. And he is quoted as saying this: "By holding the Confederate forces in check until the reserves came up, it probably saved the Union Army from defeat. What that defeat would have meant to the Union, no one can tell. Washington, Philadelphia, New York, and the whole heart of the North would have been open to invasion, and perhaps the Union cause would have been lost. So far as human judgment can determine, Colonel Colville and those 8 companies of the 1st Minnesota are entitled to rank as saviors of their country." And it was a huge deal for the town when he came up for this, because you have a very small town in Minnesota, and the President of the United States is coming up to dedicate a state monument. 1st Minnesota Day has repeatedly been proposed for July 2nd, but never passed. Most recently as March 2025. Why has this not been passed? Make 1st Minnesota Day a thing. These men are some of the original Minnesotans. There were no Minnesotans before these men, and they are heroes of their country, yet this state holiday has never been passed. And to this day, the 1st Minnesota, among Civil War historians, are known as saviors of the Union. So while doing this research, I found myself very much connecting with the Gettysburg Address. Following the Battle of Gettysburg in November 1863, Abraham Lincoln came up and gave a speech that would change the Union and change what the war meant. In reading this Gettysburg Address and thinking about it, I found myself thinking about men like Isaac and Patrick Taylor, like Charlie Goddard, like William Colville, who really sacrificed so much for the country and cared so much. And as I read the Gettysburg Address, I want you to think of the fallen men of the 1st Minnesota and what they gave their lives to. 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who gave their lives so that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hollow this ground. The men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought heretofore have just so far nobly advanced. It is rather for us here, dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Thank you for listening to my And one more thing. If you want to hear more history from me, I do have an Instagram called The People That Did Stuff. It now has 2,000 followers. It now has 2,000 followers, and we are currently doing a tournament of 64 of the most famous generals in history. It's fun. If you want to follow, it would be
I never knew that.
Doesn't surprise me.
I'm open for any questions.
Very informative,
I might ask one. You gave, towards the end, you gave pictures of the Pettis charge.
Mm-hmm.
But you put, so many times people criticize that, that flag.
Mm-hmm.
And some say, well, that wasn't even used. Or it wasn't used till the end of the war. Is that the correct flag that was used in that photograph you had up there, a ways back there, of Gettysburg?
This one?
No, before that. Right there. That one. Was that one used that day at that time? I heard it was reported used only towards the end of the Civil War. It wasn't even used. Is that true or false?
I believe it was not used till the end of the war, but towards this image as it features, this is the 1st Minnesota firing upon Confederates charging. And just, this is one of the best paintings in terms of picturing what Pickett's charge looked like for the Union and for the Confederates.
So the accuracy, that isn't accurate then?
That flag's not accurate now. They would have had they would have had flags that were more dedicated to their particular regiment. Like,
I know they had about 20 different flags total.
they had a bunch. It was very much like each regiment had their own flag custom made for where they came from. So they just put basically standard Confederate flags here, which is not accurate.
Is this one of the paintings that's in the governor's section now?
In the state capitol? I am not 100% sure on that. It would not be surprising me. I know this is this painting is at Gettysburg National Battlefield, but I couldn't chance. I don't have an answer for that.
You know what the total number of casualties and deaths were at Gettysburg?
Yeah. For the 1st Minnesota?
No, overall.
Overall, it was by far the deadliest battle of the war. I believe 80,000 is the number generally agreed upon for casualties total.
Did your research talk about any, did you learn any about any, I'm always interested in youth musicians, any drummer boys come up?
I was not, no, I did not find research on drummer boys. I just didn't come upon it in my research. I went to the archive and spent time looking at those letters, and then as well in my readings, I did not see mention of drummer boys, although I'm sure they were present.
Federal guards were a unit within the first, how long did that last?
Federal guards, they served through the entire war. Those who were injured and like they were moved to other companies if the one company was not debilitated. So the 1st Minnesota was made up of companies A through F. There was 2 St. Paul companies, one from Faribault, one from Stillwater, and then a few others from like Red Wing. And they all served as much as they could throughout the whole regiment. If a company didn't have enough men to serve in it, they would send those men to other companies.
I have a question about when you visited Gettysburg.
Yeah.
It looks like, did you do the whole walk from?
Yeah, so we did the whole walk. These are 2 photos I took. This is a photo when I started the walk, and this is a photo when I finished the walk. So they really are kind of opposite to each other. That photo is taken right here, this photo, and then this photo is taken right there.
Can you think back to something that, a feeling that you had that day, something that surprised you, or something that you didn't expect to feel or see when you were there?
To me, it was very interesting. I had watched videos and read about Gettysburg, but it's so much different actually walking that battlefield and actually experiencing like that ground. Like you hear like, oh, it was a bad place to attack, and it's like you can't really visualize it until you see it in person and walk it and you realize this is it. For me, it's both amazing to walk on the ground because I'm thinking about like, oh my God, people were like Confederates were here and this was like where the whole thing happened. But also it's very interesting to me that like the ground is not different from what it was in 1863. This is what Gettysburg looked like. And it really sets in. It's like, man, why did they attack here? Like, you really get to wonder how much Lee was in his own head walking that, because you just see, like, there's barriers here, it's just straight uphill for like a mile. Union had really well set artillery. It just really makes you wonder what the decision making was there.
What was the weather like on July 2nd, do you know?
It was fairly good. The weather was not a huge impact. It was fair weather, and it was well set, which is probably part of the reason we stayed, because it was middle of July, it was 70 degrees, it was about as nice of weather as you could get.
I was there many years ago, as I recall. Sickle has his foot there, his ankle or his foot, and he asked, what happened to my arm, or my leg? What happened to my leg? Do you know? Is that true?
I can't verify that. I know at Gettysburg there is a little monument to where he lost his leg. Yeah, if you walk, there's a spot where it marks where he lost his leg, where he was shot, all that. I can't verify if that's true or not.
It's in, by Washington.
Yeah, it's in the National Museum of Medicine in Washington, D.C.
Is there a cemetery associated with the battlefield?
Gettysburg?
Yeah.
Yeah, so Lincoln gave his Gettysburg address at a cemetery which is right by Gettysburg. There's this big cemetery, there's a monument right in the middle to the soldiers. The graves are, for the most part, are not labeled. They are blank graves, but they are marked by which regiment. And on the other side of the street is Gettysburg. It's right there, and that is where Lincoln gave his address, was in front of the in-process graveyard, because there was so many dead.
His few remarks.
Few remarks, and the previous speaker spoke for 2 hours, and Lincoln spoke for 2 minutes.
This is my most serious question. Martin Sheen or Robert Duvall?
Martin Sheen's good as Lee. Robert Duvall's also good as Lee. I lean Martin Sheen, although Gettysburg, the movie, does have some weird castings where it's like, they cast some good actors in there, but the ages don't line up. But I'd probably go Martin Sheen. I think he's good as Lee in that movie. I think actually who's better in that movie is Stephen Lang as George Piggott.
Yeah, he's always.
He's fantastic in that movie.
It is, yeah, it is a shame Minnesota was left out. See, I didn't know anything about Minnesota when I saw Gettysburg.
It's unfortunate that like you got a movie that's 4 hours and they don't. That's why I probably picked. That's why Little Round Top is so well known. It's because you just don't get mention of First Minnesota there. You get mention of Little Round Top, and that also probably is helped by the fact that Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, in contrast to people like William Colville, was very much like very self-promoting about here's what happened at the Battle of Gettysburg, and the First Minnesota men were just more reserved and did not go around tooting their own horn as much, and their story is just not as told as, like, in school you learn about Gettysburg, you learn about Pickett's charge, you don't spend much time on Gettysburg, but you learn it's the turning point of the war, here's Pickett's charge, and then you kind of move on. You don't learn, even as Minnesota studies, about the first Minnesota and these men who were really the first Minnesotans. Minnesota didn't exist before they showed up, and they fought in this battle and sacrificed so much for their country and really did save the Union.
You made a good point I never thought about, but it would have been a lot of the self-promotion that would have written the history.
Mm-hmm.
And if they weren't talking about it, nobody was writing it down.
I mean, this lost cause is such a thing. It really was just about how much are you going to promote what you did and how much are you going to put into the sphere of discussion about what you did at Gettysburg. And Minnesota just wasn't going to do that. They were more reserved following the war. Which,
All right, well, thank you, Gabe.
Yeah.